Welcome back to the class. We are going to discuss again Ulrich Beck. I'm sure that you remember this name. We had an elaborate discussion on his theory of reflexive modernity a couple of weeks ago. And in this week, this is a new week we are starting, the 8th week. And I'm planning to devote this whole week on discussing Ulrich Beck, because Beck is an extremely important scholar, and I will be able to touch upon only two of his major concepts or major argument, though Beck has written extensively on a wide variety of topics, and it's almost impossible to discuss Beck in this given limited time. So I would urge you to go to the library or to get material, both books, commentaries, articles, both by Ulrich Beck as well as about Ulrich Beck. And also there are quite a lot of interviews and lectures in the YouTube by Ulrich Beck. So I would request you to watch them carefully, because he is one of the most important scholars. Especially Ulrich Beck was in discussions in recent times in the context of COVID-19, because his argument about risk society, we will discuss that in detail maybe after the next class. We will spend some 3 hours discussing or 3 sessions discussing a risk society. So that risk society became a very important talking point in the days of COVID-19, because many of the arguments that he put forward in his theories on risk came out to be true or became very relevant in the context of this global pandemic. So in this class, I'm going to have 2 sessions on this the same reading. It's a reading on the nation state and globalization. Okay, and I'm depending upon his original essay, Redefining Power in the Global Age, Ulrich Beck. It's published in International Journal of Politics, Culture and Society, the Cosmopolitan Age. The Cosmopolitan State, Redefining Power in the Global Age. That's an essay, around 20-page essay. I thought that it would be easier for you to follow if I have this PPT rather than scrolling down the original essay. But all this PPT, everything is taken from verbatim from that essay, so that if you want to read it, or when you read it, it becomes easier for you. Okay, so it's not my writing, it's all taken verbatim from Beck's own essay. So you will see this first person coming in, it's all Beck who is mentioning about himself. So globalization in a socio-temporal, socio-theoretical context is tantamount to a revolution in the social sciences, forcing a change in perspective, a change in the paradigms from the methodological nationalism to a methodological cosmopolitanism. So this essay has roughly 2 parts. Maybe one third of the initial part, he is making very important observations about the nature of social science in the globalized era. Remember in the previous class, when we started with Manuel Castells, we also started with Manuel Castells' arguments about a new network sociology, okay, where he argued that the very fundamental character of society is undergoing change, social structure is undergoing change, and hence you also require a new sociology that is sensitive to these changes. And Beck is also saying exactly the similar things. Okay, and he's not talking about sociology as a discipline, but he's talking about the kind of methodologies or the predominant methodologies that we are following now, and how they need to be changed. So this first part of the essay, which I'm going to discuss in this class, maybe I will just touch upon some of the arguments about the second part. He's talking about the changes that are necessary in the functioning and practicing of social sciences. Okay, so globalization in a socio-theoretical context is tantamount to a revolution in social sciences, forcing a change in perspective, a change of paradigms from the predominant methodological nationalism to a methodological cosmopolitanism. So these 2 things are important. methodological nationalism and methodological cosmopolitanism. So what does he mean by that? We will come to that. I will first examine the thesis in general and then as a second step develop it in more detail using the example of a key topic, the concept of power and state. So this concept of power and state, what he does is he examines the nature of power and state in the contemporary global scenario. And he would argue that in order to capture this changing forms of power and state, you require a methodological cosmopolitanism, because this new scenario is simply beyond the reach of methodological nationalism. Okay, so that is a kind of a connection between these two sections. So let us try to understand what does he mean by the term methodological globalization, methodological nationalism and methodological cosmopolitanism. And again, please keep it in mind, Beck recognizes that many of the argument that he puts forward in this essay is strictly applicable to the Western societies, which are considered to be the highly globalized scenario. And he's of course optimistic about its applicability in the rest of the world. But for him, when he talks about cosmopolitanism, when he talks about a cosmopolitan state, he is primarily talking about the Western societies, which are most advanced and which are kind of seeing the maximum fullest potentials of globalization, a global era. So he's talking about what does internal globalization or cosmopolitization from within means. So he's talking about what does internal globalization, when you look at within a particular community, when you look at one's own society, when you look at your own neighborhood, when you look at your own immediate region, what kind of changes, what kind of cosmopolitization is happening from within. Cosmopolitization is seen as something that, not as something imposed from the top, but you are able to imbibe a whole set of new ideas, opportunities and other things. One central operational thesis, basic indicator of reflexive modernization, is the pluralization of borders. Okay, this is supposed to be the true for fundamental dualisms like the borders between nature and culture, knowledge and unawareness, subject and object, peace and war, life and death, we and other. So remember our discussion on reflexive modernity, as when we talk about how this reflexive modernity is very different from the first modernity, okay, as a radical different form. So if the first modernity was around this whole idea of very rigid boundaries, okay, here in the era of reflexive modernity, we are encountering what is called as the pluralization of borders. Okay, borders simply do not disappear, but you are encountered with a multiplicity of borders. And that's a very interesting usage, because when an imagination comes about a boundary or a border, it gives you a very idea of a very concrete structure that demarcates or distinguishes between two entities. Okay, either as a wall or as a fence or as a river, something like that. Okay, but when you have multiple borders, okay, the borders do exist, but these borders are negotiable, these borders are movable, the borders are more they are not as rigid or fixed as they are. That is what he talks about as the pluralization of borders in the era of late modernity, or that of reflexive modernity. And this borders between nature and culture, we just mentioned in the previous class, how human beings are able to make inroads into the fields that were considered to be purely in the realm of nature, genetics. Okay, we are able to define, even predict, or even engineer a child of our choice. You know that we have heard about a lot of controversies about how these designer children are being planned in China, or there are some experiments taking place. Or you can have a child with certain kind of genetic predispositions. So we are able to genetically engineer children which were simply beyond human imagination some 100 years back. Or knowledge and awareness, okay, or subject and object, or peace and war, or life and death, and we and other. So in all these things which modernity believed that there are very fundamental boundaries. Now boundaries exist, but as less fixed, as less rigid and less fixed. In terms of the methodological nationalism, which has so far been a dominant in the social sciences, these boundaries coincide the axiom of the congruity of borders. Okay, so the congruity of borders in terms of a methodological cosmopolitanism, these borders diverge. Internal globalization thus stands for dissonance in the drawing of borderlines. So we in case of methodological nationalism, as we have discussed earlier, you think that your nation state is the container. Okay, so the boundary of the nation state, okay, for example, if this is India, if this is if this is India, Indian society is considered to be is supposed to be contained within this particular boundary. And Indian economy, Indian polity, Indian society, everything you understand it as the congruity of the borders. So everything that is contained within this particular nation state is what we understood as the Indian one. So this is precisely a methodological nationalism. We confuse, or we think that the boundary of the nation state and boundary of all these social and political things are congruent. Okay, these borders coincide, the axiom of the congruity of the borders. In the terms of a methodological cosmopolitanism, these borders diverge. Okay, in the case of a methodological cosmopolitanism, which Beck argues is something so necessary in a global world, these borders really diverge. Your national boundary becomes a less significant one when you think about the national economy. Okay, your national boundary becomes less significant a point when you talk about your culture, or when you talk about your consumption, your ideas, your leisure, or any such kind of things. Okay, so internal globalization thus stands for dissonance in the drawing of borderlines. In other words, borders are no longer predetermined. They can be chosen and interpreted, but simultaneously also have to be redrawn and legitimated anew. There is both an increase in plausible ways of drawing new borders and a growing tendency to question existing borders. Okay, so here again keep it in mind that he is not saying that the borders have become irrelevant, or borders have completely disappeared and we are in a truly global world. Or as in the case of the very first lecture that we had about Friedman, when he talks about this world is a flat space where anybody can go anywhere. That simply doesn't happen. That simply doesn't happen. There are boundaries, there are borders, but these borders are becoming less permanent, less rigid, and you are able to, depending upon your position, depending upon your other thing, you are able to redraw the borders. You are able to negotiate the borders. Okay, there is an increase in the plausible ways of drawing new borders and a growing tendency to question existing borders. Globalization, understood as pluralization of borders, produces, in other words, a legitimation crisis for the national morality of exclusion. Okay, so what is he is talking about, the national morality of exclusion. Now, if you look at globalization as a pluralization of borders, okay, of course borders exist, but the borders become more and more flexible and pregnable, and in that sense it produces a legitimation crisis. What do you mean by legitimation crisis? A legitimation crisis is a crisis about its very legitimacy. Okay, I hope you understand this term. Legitimacy is something very closely connected with, maybe I can give you an example about, say, power and authority. Okay, this when I teach Max Weber, this is one of the very important argument. So power is in the conventional social sciences or in conventional sociology, power is understood as somebody's ability to influence the other person despite that person's willingness, or whether that person agrees or not, you have the ability to impose your power on somebody. Okay, so every power is not a legitimate power. So authority becomes a legitimate power. Authority means even the person who is subjected to the power agree to the fact that the other person has the right to exercise this power over somebody. Okay, so Weber describes three different types of authority. He talks about traditional authority, charismatic authority, legal. I'm not going into that. But a legitimation crisis is a crisis of its very justification. Okay, so he argues that this pluralization of borders will result in the nation state losing its ability to justify the national morality of exclusion, because we know nation states are founded on the logic of exclusion. Okay, the very idea of citizenship, and the citizens are included, non-citizens are excluded. Okay, national income, national ideas, national symbols, national culture, all these things are based on the on the national morality of exclusion. So every nation is able to build its own identity only through this process of exclusion. And he argues that globalization brings serious challenge to that. This emerges under two conditions. Firstly, insofar as the national, social and political problem context becomes transnational and are recognized as such, demanding transnational solutions in turn. So, in a globalized world, every nation is confronted with transnational challenges. Okay, whether it is at the economic front, or the best example is what is happening in the COVID-19. Since we are in that context, I am giving more and more examples from that particular case. Okay, or take the case of environmental degradation, or global warming, or nuclear disarmament. Okay, so each of these problems are transnational. Each of these issues are transnational, and a single nation state, whether it is China or USA or the Russia, they are incapable of addressing them of their own. They require a global cooperation from others. Okay, so this political problem context become transnational. Or even the example of terrorism, global terrorism. Terrorism has become a transnational phenomenon, and no single state is able to fight it, and are recognized as such, demanding transnational solutions in turn. Secondly, insofar as national and ethnic ties are pluralized, overlap are de-essentialized within and the same lived context. So the second issue is that insofar as national and ethnic ties are pluralized, okay, when the people who are defined as your own people, and the people who belong to your nation, once it becomes pluralized, it overlap and de-essentialized within one and the same lived context. So globalization also requires you to be less rigid about the definition of your people. Okay, so the sons of the soil argument becomes redundant. Sons of the soil argument become redundant because in a globalized world, you require people from across the globe. And look at maybe the USA or the London or many of the European societies, you have these people coming from across the globe. And that is what is required, or that is happening through the process of globalization. And in such a context, you will have to really be less rigid about your definition of your people, your citizens or other people are concerned. In the course of such pluralization of borders and the resulting exclusion crisis and conflicts, which assumes new patterns and forms of development, the nation-state axioms of the social sciences implode. A shift of paradigm from the prevalent methodological nationalism to methodological cosmopolitanism. Okay, so for example, who is an Indian? Okay, who is an Indian, or who is a citizen, who is an American? And we know the whole debate about or discussions and controversies about American citizenship, especially when Donald Trump became the president last time. One of his very important political promises has been to throw out all the illegal migrants. Majority of them, whom he argued have come from Mexico or other countries. So these arguments become extremely problematic when we look at it from a point of view of methodological nationalism. Rather, you will have to develop a point of view of methodological cosmopolitanism. See, Beck, in that article, he gives a lot of examples about a series of questions that you can ask in a say cosmopolitan place like London, about the number of people who are born and brought up there, number of people who have married outside their race, outside their nationality, number of people who have traveled across, number of people who have citizenship in multiple countries. So a host of questions will give you answers about a completely different idea about citizenship and then life. So methodological nationalism, meaning the explicit and implicit assumptions that the nation state is the container of social processes and that the national provides the core order for the analysis of social, economic and political processes. This is what we mentioned earlier. The nation state is the container. Okay, so everything that happens within the this particular space is what is need to be understood. Okay, so because this particular border seems to be very rigid, it seems to be very impermeable, and so when you talk about Indian society, you think about Indian society as something that is defined within the framework of nation state. And the assumed correspondence between national territory and the national, as well as the related implication that the national and the non-national are two logically mutually exclusive conditions. In fact, however, this previously constituted distinction collapses as a result of globalization process, the same point that we mentioned. And the Cosmopolitan Index of Global Cities, this is what I was mentioning a bit above. If you undertake a survey, for example, in London or in Hong Kong or in New York about about their ethnic identities, okay, about their ethnic affiliations, about their nationalities, about the languages that they know, about their life partners, about the children whom they married to other people. So if you look into that kind of a cosmopolitan index, you will see that the people who constitute that population in London or in New York are completely mixed. Okay, they are truly have that kind of a cosmopolitan background or cosmopolitan outlook. So social structures or social reality and dynamics, to put it in more carefully, are being transnationalized. That is his overall argument. Okay, so this Indian society, maybe Indian society may not be a correct answer, because India is far less transnationalized compared to many of the Western societies that Beck is actually referring to. But many age societies are being transnationalized, and here he brings in this distinction between transnationalism and internationalism. Okay, and I think we discussed these topics earlier. So when you talk about internationalism, we give priority to the different nations and we try to understand the kind of relationship between different nations. Okay, but when you talk about transnationalism, we give far less importance to the nations, but we are talking about processes that go across these national boundaries. The international, located in the external sphere of experience, corresponds to the image of a multiculturalism, in which the national self-perception is reflected and confirmed in the distinction from and exclusion of strangers. And this is a very interesting debate about multiculturalism, a concept that is more prevalent and popular in the UK or even in the US to a large extent, because UK identified their national imaginary as a place of multiculturalism. Okay, so multiculturalism, you celebrate the cultural uniqueness of different cultures. Okay, so you are basically seen as somebody who represents a culture. So whether it is Indians, South Indians, or including Indians and Pakistanis, different religious communities, different ethnic communities. So all these people put together seems to represent the British culture, British community. So that imagination, but has a problem. And what is the problem? Because it tends to essentialize each of these communities, and they tend to consolidate, they tend to crystallize, and even after so many decades, you will see they are looking at each other and they tend to exclude each other. Okay, the Sikhs will remain to be Sikhs, the Hindus will remain to be Hindus, and the regional national identities will remain to be different national identities. So there is nothing happens in between. They tend to see as very concrete, essentialized, crystallized identities, and so that there is an exclusion of the stranger. Against the backdrop of transnational, it suddenly emerges that national and international cannot be clearly differentiated, nor can they serve to separate homogeneous entities from one another. So when you look at from the background of transnational, then it becomes very clear that this distinction is no longer easier. who is a national and who is a non-national becomes very problematic thing, because many of the population, a substantial section or at least a significant section of your population might be your permanent residents, okay, who have taken new citizenship, or there could be a huge section of say migrants or refugees. So these are the people, for example, the status of a refugee. Okay, so how do you look into these accounts are become very important points. So social sciences must be founded anew as a science of transnational reality, conceptually, theoretically, methodologically, and also organizationally. The key concept of modern society, household, family, class, democracy, power, state, economy, public sphere, politics, etc., must be removed from their fixed settings in methodological nationalism. They must be redefined or rethought in the framework of methodological cosmopolitanism. This is the very important argument that he puts forward, that our framework of modernity, in which we looked at through the prism of nation state, is no longer possible. Rather, you need to have a methodological cosmopolitanism. Okay, and all these terms like household, modern society, democracy, power, state, economy, public sphere, they all need to be seen as kind of a transcending the boundaries of the nation state. So that is what the argument that he puts forward. Now, from this initial argument about the necessity to bring forth a methodological cosmopolitanism, he is going to analyze the role of power and state and how these two need to be redefined in the global age. And after this session as well as the next session, it becomes very clear for you that a framework of methodological nationalism is utterly incapable of addressing these two transformations. And this section also is important because he is bringing out some very interesting, fascinating arguments about nation state, the role of nation state in the era of globalization. So the very reason I decided to include this particular reading is because it gives you very interesting arguments about the transformation of nation state. Because nation state was a product of modernity, it is a very important symbol of modernity, and Beck has very interesting argument about the nation state in a global age. So he has a series of theses, around 6 or 7 theses that he puts forward, and I will discuss maybe first and second, maybe one more, the very first thesis in this session, and we'll take a break and we'll go to the remaining thesis in the coming class. So the first thesis, the relationship between world economy and the state now resembles a metapower. Okay, that is the power to change the rules of the national and the international power relations. The economy in particular has gained this metapower because it has broken out of the cage of the territoriality and nationally organized and dominated power conflicts and has acquired new power moves in the digital space. So by metapower game, I mean playing for the power while simultaneously changing the nation state rules of power. It is like playing the chess and changing the rules of the game along the way. So one of his very important arguments is that you need to look at the nation state, the power of nation state, not in isolation, but by looking at the relationship between the nation state and economy as something called as a metapower. Okay, a power which is beyond the strict confines of a nation state. The power to change the rules of the national and international power relations, because this metapower is able to change the rules of the nation state. And this is something extremely important, because when we talk about nation state, we used to think, we always think about sovereignty, isn't it? Nation state is tantamount, is with sovereignty. Nation state is supposed to be the most sovereign authority. So here Beck argues that this new relation between nation state and economy has redefined the position of the state as a sovereign entity. It becomes clear in the coming classes. So the threat is no longer of an invasion but of the non-invasion of investors. A very, very interesting argument, because we know that in earlier conditions every kingdom is afraid of an invasion from the neighboring countries. Every countries fought with each other. Every countries lived in a perennial fear of being invaded and conquered by the other. And here also, in the modern states also, they also have a fear of invasion. But this fear of invasion is not about being invaded. It's not about being invaded, but fear about not being invaded, okay? Or the threat of their withdrawal. There is only one thing worse than being overrun by big multinationals: not being overrun by multinationals. Okay, so imagine a prospects where all major multinational companies decide to withdraw from India. Okay, that could be a major nightmare to the administrators. And remember, we had during 60s or early 70s, we had political decisions where many of these multinational companies were forced to leave, because that was a time of national, very strong nationalism. Now, our ministers, our prime minister, our ministers, all of them are going abroad to invite investment. The new global economic power of big business is thus, in this sense, not founded on violence as the ultimate rationale to force their will upon others. It is precisely this which makes it so much more mobile, that is, not tied to any specific location and consequently globally disposable. Okay, so now every country is a kind of a disposable thing for most of the multinational companies. I hope you are familiar with this recent arguments about China plus one policy. Because of this recent controversies about China's very aggressive foreign policy, every major organization is planning for another country. So of course they will invest in China, but they are also getting prepared to come out of China, so that China plus one becomes an important policy. So every country is, in that sense, is a globally disposable. Of course the markets matter, but every country, at least in theoretically, is globally disposable. The power of the state is thus not undermined or broken by state power, that is military threat and conquest, but rather deterritoriality, exteriority, by way of new weightlessness of a transnational trade and activity in the digital space. This deterritorial conception of power reverses the logic of the traditional understanding of power, violence and authority. Okay, so this is a very important understanding of power. I mentioned about a Weberian understanding of power, that you understand power as emanating from one thing and it imposes on certain thing, which is mostly either with use of violence or with the threat of use of violence. Okay, but here this power is something very different. It's something very closely associated with the kind of a Foucauldian understanding of power. Even the threat to withdraw from your territory can really shatter your ideas and other things. So two often unseen consequences of this meta power of global economy are really remarkable. So far, throughout history, the rules of the games of the world politics have been bloody and imperialist. The new global meta power is in essence pacifist, may not be in its consequence. So one of the things that he says is that this meta power could be non-violent. It's not very bloody, or it's not based on conquest or blood bath and other thing, but it could be more pacifist. But its consequences could be equally violent. That's a different matter. Second, perhaps and only in a special sense, cosmopolitan corporations and maybe a cosmopolitan capitalism is in the making. Global corporations are using and developing the productivity of diversity. The mixing of races, ethnic groups and nationalities at home and abroad is becoming their central resource for creativity, and at the same time a dominant employment policy of transnational corporations. So he's talking about the possibility of a cosmopolitan corporations or even a cosmopolitan capitalism, which really benefits from the availability of cosmopolitan talents from across the globe. And again, I am inviting your attention to the recent controversy in the US, where the Trump administration decided to impose a lot of restrictions on the H-1B1 visas of highly skilled people. And almost all major leaders of technological firms, whether Sundar Pichai or Zuckerberg or everybody, came against, saying that America or Silicon Valley is able to make this headway only because they had the best minds coming from across the globe. and that should not be undermined. So this he talks about it as the very first thesis. Okay, so we will continue in the next class, in the next session. Again, it will be a continuation of the same essay. Okay, thank you.